Okay, so what we're going to be doing in these last couple of chapters is to go through sort of a more real-world scene with a little more robustness. So if you've seen my first DVD, you'll know that basically I like to work with simple scenes to talk about concepts and then use a more real-world scene to put these concepts into practice. All right, so let's talk about this scene for a little bit. This is a strange, sort of unusual places, and we looked at some images of abandoned insane asylums and sort of brought up this context and an image very similar to this that we sort of interpreted in our own way. So Eric and I built this model, and then I worked on the textures and stuff, and Eric's been really helpful with me on this, so I want to make sure to give him some credit for this. So thank you very much, Eric, for helping me out on this scene and for working with it. So let's just take a look at what we've got here. We've kind of got a lot of ideas that we want to put in, so it would be a good test bed. And so this scene is going to be available on a DVD. It's not going to have the textures, unfortunately, because the textures that I have done in this scene will involve some texture libraries that are I've got some copyright issues, so I'll probably not be able to give you the textures, but it'll definitely give you the scene and be able to experiment with different lighting situations, which is my general goal in here. Okay, so let's take a look at the scene. I have got, if we look at it, let's see, go into wireframe mode, so it's a little bit better that way. We've basically got this indoor scene, right? With this big bathtub in it, that's sort of the central piece, and this wall, which is all this stuff on to our scene. So we created this window here, and created this skylight, and we've also created this back room in here, which I've sort of made probably way too big, but enough space. I made enough space back there in case I wanted to try to achieve some light coming through the door at some point. I will use, some of them I won't. I've obviously put in these light fixtures that are coming down here, and I've got these windows that are open. There's a lot of potential that we can sort of play with and get a lot of different ideas and practice a lot of different methods of doing different interesting lighting in our scene. So what I like to do when I start the scene is to keep it really, really, really simple. So in terms of materials, as we know, to start with. And usually what that means is that we're going to do when we're doing that is, if we're going to have glass, which we do here, you can either just not have glass at all and just let the sunlight come through, or if you're going to have glass, you're going to have to use this, a V-ray glass situation here. A few things to note: when you create a V-ray glass, in order for light to go through, you're going to have to go into the shader. So here's the shader. Actually, you know what? Here, and you're going to have to make sure that the value of that is black. That is actually only important if you're going to have reflections, because in our situation, we're never going to actually, in this view we have, we're actually never going to see the glass directly. So I don't really care about the diffuse color at all. All I really care about is the opacity. In fact, you see I don't even have reflections. But what I do have is 100% refraction, which makes this glass transparent. So, and that means basically turn it up all the way. That's all I really care about. Next thing I have is I have to turn on this effect shadow and effect alpha. Those are sort of important things in order for the shadows and all the other stuff that come through. Effect alpha is actually only for the alpha of the window, but I definitely have to turn on effect shadows. I usually just turn both these on when I'm doing glass. It just makes things a lot easier. And then I just don't have to worry about them anymore. Okay, so that's our glass. That's our material for everything else. And so now let's start looking at our lighting situation. Okay, so as you know, when we're doing lighting, as you may have seen from I'm just going to experiment with moving it around a little bit. I actually have another light saved for the location I want because I've gone through this quite a bit. But I'm going to talk about some quick and dirty methods. So right now, let's just sort of place our sun in a different location here than I would have originally. And I'm going to do that. Sorry. Move it over here. So sun will be, let's make it a little higher and a little more interesting. Kind of like that. And what we're going to do is we'll look at a few things of how to get these really quick and dirty results we need out of our lighting. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to go to the rendering, and what I'm going to do for my indirect illumination, I'm going to have light cache on both of them on. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just turn on fixed rate subdivisions for the anti-aliasing. This makes my subdivisions basically no anti-aliasing, just straight samples. And it can go through some situations real quick. In fact, we'll just go through them very quickly in here without sort of pausing the video to sort of show you what I mean by that. And we'll do a few examples of that. So in my indirect illumination, actually, I'm even going to turn this off. I'm going to do store direct light, and it's going to become a key thing, and you'll see why. Turn my subdivisions nice and low, well, low enough, 500. And let's just go ahead and do a quick render of this and see what we get. So you can see that if I have the show calc phase on, let's go ahead and minimize that. Oops. You can sort of see very quickly what's going to happen. This nice version of V-Ray actually gives you a prediction of how long it's going to take to do the calculations. And you'll see that basically this is our indirect light, and we're actually not getting any sunlight in our scene because it was probably placed a little too high for the situation. So we're still getting indirect light in here, which is interesting. Real quick and dirty results. So let's go ahead and move the light to a lower position. Something like that. Well, maybe a little not so high. And let's go ahead and move it about like that. Yeah, that's fine. Go back to our camera and try another render. You see we can get these really quick and dirty results in about 20-40 seconds to just sort of get an idea of what's going on. Now, thing to note, what I did is when I did the light cache, you remember I did store direct light with the light cache. What that means is basically it's a similar thing. It'll actually and then we'll go ahead and render that, see what we get. Turn the frame buffer on. There we go. So we've got a couple interesting things going on. We got the window here, and we got that skylight going on here. So you can sort of experiment with different lighting situations real quick and dirty and see what happens. And you'll also notice, obviously, because it's doing the light cache, it's doing all the GI, you'll get a quick idea of exactly how much light can penetrate and how much it can bounce around and everything else. So we're getting nice quick and dirty results just with that. I actually kind of like this lighting. Probably should have used something similar to this, but that's all right. think that's the wrong one. Let me just, sorry, turn that off. Let's go through that one real quick. Hide selected, unhide by name. Light 2 is the one I've already done, selected. So I'm going to go ahead and select that light. Light 2, turn that on. Let's go ahead and test that. And then we'll talk about the lighting intensity as well, actually. So that's the lighting that I've selected. So create a nice raking light that goes across here. You'll notice that the light that I have has got a strong multiplier. I've gone through some exercises. Obviously, you're going to probably have to go through these as well when you go through your scene. Sort of experiment with different intensities. And these intensities are going to vary based on how of exactly the position you want. These are small little renders. Think of them almost as sketches if you're going to think of it artistically, like quick and sketch to see what's going on. We're going to see if that shadow actually gives a good play in terms of everything else. Now you're going to have to go a little bit higher in terms of your quality. So go ahead. So it'll go through the light cache situation now, as you see. This program is capturing the video at the same time, so there's some processor sharing that's happening. All right, so it's almost done with the, it slows it down a little bit, obviously, when you turn that off. And then, because I've turned Store Direct Light off, it'll slow down as well in terms of calculating the shadows. And you'll see that we get a little better idea of the area shadows that we want. So that size is something else you're going to have to play with to find out how soft you want your sunlight to come through the window. But you can get a good idea that you know, of what you have in your scene. And you'll see that, for example, you know, you're getting a nice sharp shadow from the tub because that's close to the zone, but then the window gets nice and soft because that's fairly far away from its source as a reflection. I mean, as a shadow. So I'll just let this finish up real quick. It won't take too much longer. In fact, we can see that it's going to take 1:28. I love this new timer. It's great. This is actually a brand new version of V-Ray, and it should be out by the time this DVD is out, so you guys should be enjoying this right around the same time. And you'll see that we've done a few things where we've actually taken some of these window panes and made them opaque, you know, trying to make it as authentic as possible. I think this scene turned out real good. So again, thanks a lot to Eric Sheely for helping on this, for modeling and coming up with some artistic ideas together. I think it was a great collaboration. All right. So it's done, and so a little more robust test for shadows took about 2 minutes, 10 seconds, and that's with the capture. So generally speaking, pretty fast, quick and dirty. It's great to deal with in terms of just coming up with these renders. Okay, so we also had our HDR on in this scene. I believe we did. No, I turned it off. Okay, good. That just gave us our light. So now let's actually see what happens when we turn on our HDR, and I'll probably start pausing them from now on. But I'm going to turn the HDR on in our scene, and you see I have a multiplier of 5, and I placed the HDR and rotated it to be approximately the same position as sun, very similar to what we've done on the first DVD. But this is dealing with interiors, so we have to deal with these strong multipliers to get the light to come into our scene a lot more. And this has become sort of an important thing, is balancing that intensity of key to fill as we're having to deal with our interior scenes. So let's go ahead and see what that does. And go ahead and turn on the skylight. Turn on that one. I'm not sure. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and render and pause the video. Okay, that's done, and you'll notice that basically our fill is a lot nicer. We've got a lot more kind of ambient light going on in all these areas. Don't worry about the quality, obviously, you already know about that, but we're getting some nice things happening, especially like this area here. You start to notice how things go on in there. But another thing you like to do is if I'm going to have a nice low sun here, you're going to want to be able to tint it. As the sun gets lower in the sky, it tends to turn a little more yellow. So I'm going to tint this sun a little bit, and I'm going to do that by just sort of turning it up to a little more yellow tint. Probably a little more on that orange side like that. Give it a little more zing. So let's go ahead and look at what that does. We'll go ahead and render that and pause the video. Okay, so as you'll see, I've tilted the sun a little bit yellow, and you won't see it in the direct sun because that sun is very, very bright. It's at the level of 15. You'll just see white, but you definitely see the influence of the yellow in the rest of the scene. Another great little experiment when you're doing these extremely sort of correction tool here. I'm going to sort of set it aside here, let's make a little more space, try to get both of them in the same slot. And then if you turn this exposure on and you use exposure, you can expose up your scene and or expose down, and you can really kind of get an idea of what's happening. Keep in mind that everything that's rendered out of V-Ray is going to come in as an HDR, as an HDR, so you can really kind of get what's going on, and you have a lot of dynamic range in your scene, so it's really kind of a nice thing to I need a little more exposure in terms of my key to fill. Let's bring this back up to 0 here. You can turn on this curve, which we've used in the past for doing the gamma correction, but we can actually sort of use it instead to see if you need to balance your key to fill. So if you need to make sure your fill needs to be dimmer, you can take this down and expose it down and say, I need less fill in here or something. So you can use these curves to experiment with your lighting and then adjust your lighting based on that. It's kind of a very useful thing to have, and then you can just do reset tangent and boom, you're back to where you were before. So okay, so we'll be doing this again in the future exercises, so in this scene, so keep that in mind. All right, so now we've got our scene set up. We've got the sort of the yellow tint going on, and we've got, you know, kind of the general idea of what we're going to do. Now we need to start thinking about the space, because as you know, the space itself is just as important to the lighting in terms of because that becomes the environment that light bounces around as well. So we're going to be experimenting with some shaders. So let's go ahead and talk about how we start to deal with the interior space. Alright, so I basically have a new version of the scene, and what I did is I kind of had an idea of what color I wanted things to be before I started texturing. And texturing becomes an exercise that sort of coincides with lighting. You don't sort of texture and then light. You sort of have to do the two together. Thing. A few things to note before we start thinking about this. As you remember, we've talked about our color of our space. I mean, in terms of color space of monitor versus monitor space versus linear space, and we've done that by adjusting our frame buffer here. And as you know, there's several ways to do it, and there's different logics for why you'd want to do different ones. What I've actually done is I'm just going to gone ahead and burned it into the image for this one, and some people would say would frown upon it. I'm just going to say, who cares? I'm just doing the experiment. So I know I've got my monitor burned in to the 2.2 gamma, which is basically, or 1 over 2.2 is 0.454545, so it's done right there. And then what I've done is I've got my shaders set up here. Now, an important thing to note is in order to see what the real color is of this shader, this is what the color needs to be painted at, okay? But the way you need to paint your colors in terms of your textures at a color space that is linear for it to then be exposed up at 2.2. But the way that it's going to be seen by V-Ray is actually different. So when you're making your colors here, what I like to do is the following. Go to the preferences here, go to the gamma, set it up to the 2.2 gamma, and enable gamma. When I do that, you'll see that it'll expose it correctly. So I'm basically making this tile this kind of, you know, baby bluish green, kind of hospital-y green look to it, right? And it kind of looks like that. So let's take a blank one here. I'm going to go have a V-Ray material, and I'm going to say, okay, I want to make a color that looks kind of yellowish. Okay, so light yellowish, and I'm going to go say, well, let's see, do it about like that. Okay, that's pretty ugly yellow. And you'll see that that means that I actually have to paint it at approximately this color. So paint at the color that's linear, but V-Ray will see it at the color that's normal. All right. Okay, that's done. So I've done my tile, and even though V-Ray looks at it as this very dark and saturated green, we know that it actually is going to be this light green color. I also have my tub, which I've created sort of a brighter white color, and I've got the back walls, or all the walls actually. And you'll see that my walls, even though it looks like this dark brown color, again, we can just turn this on. It's actually going to be sort of this lighter brown color. All right. Okay, so we've got an idea of what's going on in our scene. Other thing I've done is on this tile, I've made it reflective. Okay, same way that I've always tend to make things reflective. Use it for nail fall off, and I put a little glossiness on that tile. I don't want it perfectly glossy. Tub, consider pretty shiny. Don't worry about the glossiness too much. Again, this is just for ballpark, getting an idea, because these are major. The walls and this tub are probably, and the tile obviously, are the major things that need to reflect light into order to pick up color or bounce light around. So those are the only things I'm really going to worry about. It's not going to be exactly like the scene. I want to make sure you know that, but it's going to be good enough for me to start thinking about how to point my textures in and save me some time in terms of doing that. So wall is just standard wall. I got no reflection on it at all. And I've gone ahead and pre-rendered these scenes. So I'm going to do the same. You'll see that that green is kind of picked up along the way, and we're getting our reflections going on. And this wall has got, you know, a nice sort of tint to it. We've got a good idea of what's happening in our scene. So this gives us an idea of where to start painting our textures. And as you'll see, that when I came to a final texture, it wasn't quite like this. Done a few changes along the way, but it gave me a good idea of where to start. And you know, quick render times, so I can come through a lot of color iterations real quick. It's like, I don't like this green tile. I want to make it yellow. I want to make it red. I want to make it blue. All right, so I've gone ahead and rendered my textures, created my textures, and you'll see actually the viewport give you an idea of the color of the textures. This is another thing you can do experimenting in terms of your gamma and corrected and non-gamma corrected space. There's remove the gamma, put it back on. It's kind of a good, useful thing to have, is this sort of experiment in between them. I wish there was actually a toggle, but that's all right. Okay, now that we've done that, I'm kind of look at some of these textures and that we've got. Like, for example, let's take the wall. And I've kind of done a similar thing on most of my textures, but there's textures you want to apply to several different elements. If we take the diffuse color, for example, let's go ahead and look at that. I'm going to turn this off. So this is kind of what my diffuse color looks like, and this is after we applied the gamma. I'm going to do this a lot. You'll notice. I'll turn it off. You'll see that that's what it looks like when it's uncorrected. It's very dark. So I actually painted it very dark, knowing that once I've applied my gamma correctly, it will end up looking like that. So I kind of knew exactly what I was doing. So my wall has a color that's about like that in terms of my diffuse color. And then what I do for my reflection is I do my Fresnel reflection as well. I've applied Fresnel reflection to absolutely everything in my scene, and I find it to be very useful if you start thinking that way. I know it may seem extremely expensive, but it's an important concept. And so my specular color, I kind of done this, and where got a neutral sort of mid-gray tone. Keep in mind that when you're looking at reflection maps, you don't need your gamma correction, so it actually is seen by V-Ray like this. So that's about a 50% gray color. That means I've got about a 50% on the reflective side of it. But my sort of dirty spots, my spongy spots, I figured those were probably more reflective, meaning they've got more wear on it. So I actually turned those brighter. Thought that was a good way to sort of think of it. And then the next thing I did is on my glossiness. We'll go ahead and look at that. You'll see that I actually have some glossiness as well. And I've turned that down where this is more shiny, these little zones, and then this has more roughness to it, so therefore is a little more gray. So you want to sort of apply textures to all three of those, and I actually even have a undulation is well achieved through this bump map. Okay, so we're in good shape to look at that. Now another important thing to note is if we look at, let's go to this perspective view here. The glass. I think you can actually only see it from a distant angle, right? Right. And the glass has got an opacity to it that has got a texture. And because we're dealing with a ray tracer, opacity picks up color as well. So if I look at my glass, along the corners and all of this tinting, this yellowish tinting. When I've done this, I've effectively cut the light down quite a bit in our scene, and so you may have been noticing this whole time that the light looked really bright coming in, and that's because I kind of knew piece of glass here, and then these three windows represent these three windows here, 1, 2, 3. So UV layouts are important when you're doing textures, but that's not the subject of this DVD. Okay. had to go through several versions of textures to get the right look, but you're just going to be noticing the final one. And again, I'm doing a similar thing here, but you'll notice I've actually started to use a radiance map now. I've got it on custom. If I actually put it on low, you'll notice it says surface normals 0.03 and then distance normals 0.1. But if I go to customs, I actually turned that to 0.2. And even if I went to medium, that's going to be a 0.1, and I even turned that down here. So I'm going to go to custom, go back to -2 and -1. The reason I did that is a key thing. These grout lines, which I physically modeled, these aren't done with a displacement. Actually, Eric and I modeled these. Quite a bit in terms of making sure that normal threshold down. That helps quite a bit in terms of making sure that picking up the samples in those little zones in there. Okay, so now we've got that, and we're going to do a test render of our scene, and this is what it basically came out to be. We're just shy of 6 minutes, which is not bad for a fully textured scene. Some of these textures are 2K. We're in good shape. Memory wasn't too bad. And you'll see that obviously, as I told you, these windows will dim the light quite a bit. The tiles come down in intensity as well and everything. But we've kind of got the right ballpark. And what the render hit is, and you'll probably notice it'll be significant. But let me go ahead and open that scene. I'm going to pause and open the scene to show you this. And you'll see that, for example, I've got my adaptive quality Monte Carlo on. The other thing I've done is I've gone to my radiance map, turned that up to higher quality. I've gone up one rate in terms of the rate of the radiance map. I've pumped up the amount of samples that I need to basically 1,000. Another thing to keep in mind, when I do store direct light, it doesn't affect the shadows because this is only dealing with secondary bounces, so it's not going to mess up my reflection shadows. So this actually becomes pretty much pointless when I have it on a secondary bounce only. If I had it in a primary bounce, it would be a problem, but it's not. Okay, sorry, that was a little sidetrack. Other thing I've done is I've gone back to my light, my sunlight here, and I've increased the subdivisions quite a bit. I want to make sure I get a nice smooth shadow. So these reflections are quite noisy here, probably lost in all the noise of everything else going on in the scene, but trust me, they're not the highest quality shadows. So I turned that up to 16. And that's going to slow down our renders quite a bit. So with all that being done, you'll see that basically we've gone, probably about 2.5 times the rendering time to get all the high quality up. But this is a pretty good render. These shadows are very smooth. The space is nicely aliased or anti-aliased, where we're still picking up some nice effects here. Actually, you see that right there? This slight sheen here is actually specular. If the camera was moving, you would really see that specular. It's a reflection of what's going on in this tile here, and it's it's quite nice to see all these sort of things. Lighting real quick on a scene and how to set it up and go through it step by step. Now what we're going to look at is doing the same scene with a different type of lighting setup and see how that can differ.